The first adult brain structure we're going to cover is going to be the cerebrum or the cerebral hemispheres. The cerebrum or the cerebral hemispheres arise from the secondary brain vesicle, the telencephalon. The telencephalon arises from the primary brain vesicle, the prosencephalon or the forebrain. So the prosencephalon or the forebrain give rise to the secondary brain vesicle, the telencephalon. And the telencephalon is going to give rise to our cerebral hemispheres or the cerebrum. The cerebral hemispheres make up about 83% of the brain's overall mass. That's a huge portion of the brain mass just accounted for by these cerebral hemispheres. On the outside, the cerebral hemispheres have a couple of important characteristics or structures. They have these elevated ridges. These elevated ridges here are known as gyri. The shallow grooves separating these elevated ridges are known as sulci. And then some of these deeper grooves are going to be known as fissures. So the elevated ridges are gyri, the shallow grooves are sulci, and the deeper grooves are fissures. When we take a look at a cross-section of our cerebral hemisphere, or if we look on the inside of our cerebrum, we'll see that the cerebrum is going to be divided into three regions. It's going to be divided into a cerebral cortex. That's going to be that outside ring or cortex of gray matter. It's going to be composed of internal white matter. And then it's going to be composed of those islands of gray matter throughout the white matter. Those are known as basal nuclei. So if we look at our cerebral hemispheres on the inside, it's going to be divided into three regions. That outer ring of gray matter, known as the cerebral cortex, the internal white matter, and then those islands of gray matter called basal nuclei. So first we're going to focus on our cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex, remember, is that outer ring or that outer cortex of gray matter. Very briefly, the cerebral cortex functions as the executive suite of the nervous system, or our conscious mind. So the cerebral cortex enables us to be aware of ourselves, our sensations, gives us the ability to communicate, understand, and initiate voluntary movements. So the cerebral cortex functions as really the executive suite of the nervous system. It is where our conscious mind is located. So this is how we're able to be aware of ourselves, our sensations, allow us to communicate, remember, understand, and initiate voluntary movements. The cerebral cortex is composed of gray matter. Remember, gray matter is composed of neuron cell bodies, as well as short non-myelinated axons, or short non-myelinated neurons. Although the cerebral cortex is only about 2 to 4 millimeters thick, it accounts for 40% of the total brain mass. So even though this region looks very, very small, remember that that cerebral cortex has all of those convolutions or infoldings, and that really maximizes the surface area and therefore maximizes the number of neurons that can be present in this brain region. So although that cerebral cortex does appear very thin, so only about 2 to 4 millimeters thick, there are tons and tons of neurons in this region because of the increased surface area due to the convolutions or the foldings. The cerebral cortex is going to be composed of many, many layers of neurons. All of the neurons in our cerebral cortex are interneurons. So remember when we functionally classified neurons, we classified them as sensory neurons, interneurons, or motor neurons. Interneurons exist exclusively in the central nervous system, and they communicate in between our sensory neurons and our motor neurons. So our cerebral cortex is going to be composed of many, many layers of neurons, all of which are going to be considered interneurons. So we can see that here. So we can actually see that we've got 6 layers of neurons in our cerebral cortex. All of these neurons in the cerebral cortex are going to be interneurons. Lastly, I just wanted to point out that the majority of the gray matter in our cerebral hemispheres is located in the cerebral cortex. Any other gray matter that exists in our cerebral hemispheres is going to be called subcortical gray matter. And subcortical gray matter is going to be those islands of gray matter. They're going to be known as basal nuclei. So when we're talking about gray matter of our cerebral hemispheres, we're either talking about the cerebral cortex or we're talking about subcortical gray matter, in which case we're referring to any gray matter or islands of gray matter that exist throughout our white matter. Those are known as basal nuclei. The cerebral cortex can be divided into different lobes. So the cerebral cortex can be divided into the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and then if you were to actually pull back the frontal lobe and pull down the temporal lobe, you'd gain access to the insular lobe. So our cerebral cortex can be divided into different regions or different lobes. The frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and then deep to the frontal and the temporal lobe, we're going to find the insular lobe. There are 4 cerebral cortex generalizations that I want you to keep in mind as we work through our cerebral cortex areas and their corresponding functions. So there's a couple of cerebral cortex generalizations that we're going to make about this region of our cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral cortex can not only be divided into different lobes, but it can also be divided into functional areas. There are 3 types of functional areas of the cerebral cortex. There's motor areas, sensory areas, and association areas. Motor areas and sensory areas are not the same thing as motor and sensory neurons. Remember that cerebral cortex is composed exclusively of interneurons. So sensory neurons and motor neurons do not exist here. So keep that in mind as we work through our different functional areas of the cerebral cortex. The second generalization is that each hemisphere is primarily concerned with the sensory and motor functions of the opposite or the contralateral side of the body. So in other words, my right hemisphere is chiefly concerned with the left side of my body. My left hemisphere is chiefly concerned with the right side of my body. So each hemisphere is primarily concerned with the sensory and motor functions of the contralateral or the opposite side of the body. The third generalization is that the cerebral cortex has lateralization or specialization of cortical functions. So in other words, although each hemisphere is largely symmetrical in structure, so the 2 hemispheres do look very similar, they're not entirely equal in function. So there's lateralization or specialization of cortical functions in the different hemispheres. So in other words, the two different hemispheres do carry out some distinct functions. So they're specialized for specific functions. And then lastly, I want to point out that as we're working through our cerebral cortex functions, we're going to go into it in a very gross oversimplification of the cerebral cortex. So it's especially important for you to realize that no functional area of the cerebral cortex acts alone. So we're going to walk through the individual functions of the different functional areas, so the motor areas, the sensory areas, and the association areas. But this is a gross oversimplification, right? None of these functional areas actually act alone. All of them are actually going to act together in order to control conscious behavior.